Speaker, what the government confirmed in the House this afternoon in question time is that the wage gap between New Zealand and Australian workers has widened significantly. We put the figure up, provided by the Parliamentary Library, that the wage gap between New Zealand workers and Australian workers has increased by over $50 a week. John Key came back with the best massaged figures that he could find, and even his figures, tabled in the House on request, showed that the gap had risen by $23 per week for the average worker since the election. That is the same John Key that went to this country before the last election promising that the fundamental purpose of his government would be to close that wage gap. Mr. Speaker, he has failed. He has failed on his own admission today. And not only will those workers find that they're more than $50 a week further behind their Australian counterparts, on the 1st of October this year, each one of those workers will be paying 50% more in consumption tax than their Australian counterparts, despite the fact that Jerry Brownlee and John Key promised this country there'd be no rise in GST. They broke that promise. They broke their word. And for the sake of the next speaker that will try to tell us, but income tax has been cut, yes, for cabinet ministers, they'll be paying 33 cents in the dollar while their Australian counterparts are paying 45 cents. That's for cabinet ministers. But for the ordinary working New Zealander on or below the average wage, they will continue to pay more tax than their Australian counterparts. A widening gap in wages, 50% more in consumption tax, and still paying more income tax than their Australian equivalents. Now, we've had all sorts of rhetoric from National about how they were going to close the gap. Jerry Brownlee came into the House and said, "I've got a great idea. Step change. We're going to dig up our national parks." What a shambles. What a shambles. That minister, Mr. Speaker, absolutely humiliated last week. Absolutely humiliated. His job is under threat. Make no doubt about it. His job is under threat. He is an underperformer in that cabinet. But then there's a lot of them, so maybe that will help him. What about then the job summits? The job summit was going to produce a whole lot more jobs. What did we get? Almost nothing, Mr. Speaker. Nothing. The Australians produced jobs. The job summit failed. And then, of course, there were the other bright ideas by John Key. The New Zealand is a world financial services hub. New Zealand partnered by the Chinese to deliver broadband. What happened to those ideas? Where have those ideas gone? They were gone by lunchtime, Mr. Speaker. And then there was the 2025 task force. Remember, that was to close the gap? The day that was announced, Mr. Speaker, the day that it was announced, it was dumped in another shambles by this government. What all of those things show is that there is no plan. There is no plan to close the gap. That gap is widening. That government has failed. Don Brash, their former leader, said that. He said that on their current policy track, they will not close the gap. Then there's Alan Bollard. He's a neutral public servant. He said that that sort of posturing from the national government was, quote, unrealistic. That's the politest word that he could use.
What did he say in private?
The difference between Labor and the National Party is that Labor does have a plan. We've got a plan for skill training because we know that we need to upskill New Zealanders, their capacity and their productivity. And we wouldn't be locking out 5,000 students from tertiary education like this government has over the last couple of weeks. We wouldn't be running down the apprenticeship system like the National Party is again. And Labor has a plan to invest in research and development because we know we need a smart economy. Australia has increased it by 25%. This government cut the 15% tax credit for research and development. They dumped the $700. This government has failed on every front. It has no plan. New Zealanders deserve better.